Hello, Stephen Tellis.
Hi, Glenn Lowry. How are you?
I'm doing well, Steve. Welcome to the Glenn Show. This is Glenn Lowry of bloggingheads.tv and Brown University, and I have the pleasure of talking with my old friend, Stephen Tellis, who's professor of politics at Johns Hopkins University and a commenter on matters political for many years now. Steve and I go way back to the 90s,
That's
and
right.
good to be talking with you.
And so I've known at least three Glenn Lowrys.
Oh, no, have you really?
Hey, that was a
Well,
transition to our topic. You notice that, Glenn?
I like the segue, man. You could be on the Sunday shows. Wait a minute, I just did something wrong and I can't see you anymore.
Oh shit.
No, what I did was I expanded. I can see you. I can see you. Okay, so I just expanded the wrong window, and we're back in business now.
Okay, all right, here we go.
Yeah, here we go. So yeah, you've known at least three Glenn Lowrys, and that segues into our topic for this Blogging Heads conversation today, which is changing of minds. How a person changes their mind, how a political movement might change its mind. It happens that I'm writing a book about the first of these questions, and that you are writing or have written a book about the second of them. And we thought, therefore, that we might like put our heads together and see if there's something we can learn from each other and something we can say of value to our audience.
That's all right. Let's do it.
Okay, well,
All
let's
right.
do it.
So we're starting with you. We're starting. We're putting you under the microscope first.
Well, you say you've known at least three Glenn Lowrys. I'd like you to expand on that.
Oh, great. So I have to count all the Glenn Lowrys I know.
Well,
So I knew. Okay. So I knew a Glenn Lowry before I knew you personally, right?
hmm,
So I was in college. I was reading you in the Public Interest and Commentary and New Republic. And I don't know if I've told you that, but you were a very big influence on me when I was in college and I was figuring out, where I was. And then when I was at my first job at Hamilton College in upstate New York, frozen upstate New York,
yeah.
I read, a piece about you in the New Yorker. I think it was when I was at Hamilton, or it might have been when I first got to Boston, and that's when you were in the process of starting to transition to a second Glenn Lowry. You were still, in transit, I think.
Okay,
Uh,
so excuse me for interrupting because this is
okay.
about me and I love hearing it, but what was the characteristic of the first Glenn Lowry that influenced you? And likewise, what is this second Glenn
So
Lowry that
okay,
you
so the
remember?
first so the first Glenn Lowry, I mean that's a period I think of the other people's. I always considered myself a Democrat, a liberal, even if nobody else thought I was. And that was a period when I think it's reasonable to say there was a lot of interesting conservative writing out there. I was grappling with Larry Mead's writing at the
Yeah,
same time. I'd read Beyond Entitlement. I read every issue of the Public Interest. I'd go and sort of grab it, as soon as it came out and study it with Talmudic kind of
yeah.
care. And so that was a period when I was trying to make sense of how liberalism could sort of deal with these insights that people like you, when you were in your neoconservative phase, and Larry Mead and Charles Murray, who I always disagreed with, but I was always, at least earlier on, thought he was a better interlocutor than he turned out to be. All that work, and even stuff by Richard Newhouse, all those things where I think were influencing me. And that was also a period when I think I was, particularly pissed off with liberalism. And so I shared a kind of temperamental anti-liberalism with people who are neoconservatives, even if I wasn't willing to go as far ideologically as they were. Right? I understood that the temperament of just being fed up and not wanting to buy the party line. That part I agreed with, and I think your position on racial issues at that time had a lot of resonance to me. This is also a period when I was reading a lot of Black political thought. And I think I saw that sort of older debates about collective versus individual responsibility. I taught my first class at Hamilton College was a class on Black political thought that I taught in the context of American political thought. And these questions of individual and collective responsibility were something that's a recurrent feature of Black political thought, just like it's a recurrent feature of American political thought. And so I saw you in a way as having being part of that very long debate, and also I think being different than a lot of other neoconservatives in that you didn't firmly put yourself down on one side or the other. And I think that's where I'm going to push back against, in some sense, against there being 3 or 4 Glenn Lowrys, because I do think there is a kind of continuity in your thought, even as you've been rejecting the previous Glenn Lowrys.
Okay, let me just interject for a moment. Again, it's music to my ears. We're talking about Glenn Lowry. What could be better than that? But the viewers out there may need some context, and let me help, if I can, by observing, you're talking about the 1980s, I assume, when you were a college student and these things were going on, and Glenn Lowry was emerging as a neoconservative, as a black neoconservative critic of liberal social policy, and you found something to resonate with there. And this was a period, if I may, when the kind of idealism of the 60s and 70s about the urban and racial problems of the country was wearing thin for many people. Certainly this Glenn Lowry was, in my early years of neoconservatism, motivated by a sense that, man, the vocabulary, the kind of conceptual framework for analyzing the race problem and the urban problem was, on the left, was exhausted, that it just wasn't resonant enough with the facts on the ground and the realities in the lives of people. And it had become ossified. It had become a kind of self-perpetuating dogma. And it didn't accommodate criticism. It didn't seem open to modification. So, again, reporting for myself now, I'm working on this memoir project, so I've been thinking a lot about this. And I've been asking myself, what were your real motivations when you were breaking with your friends and with your co-racialists and your comrades in arms for racial equality? And part of it was just fury at the fact that if you said anything that was slightly off color, like, Larry Mead in Beyond Entitlement might have a point, that the welfare state giveth with one hand, but to a certain extent taketh with the other. That material redistribution is not the same thing as like capabilities redistribution, like empowering of people. Like we had to look at the behavior of people as well as their asset holdings in order to get some sense of what it was that kept them down. And these were ideas that made sense to me, and you could voice them in certain company, and a ton of bricks would fall on you, and people would dismiss you, and they'd call you a name. Uncle Tom would be the kindest of it that they might call you. And so there was a certain... in this sense that the framework coming out of the 60s of how do we think about the race problem and the urban problem on the left was exhausted, but that people were closed to any investigation, any criticism, any reevaluation, reassessment, reformulation, just made me so angry that I found myself looking for chances to get up in their face.
Well, that's why. Can I get
absolutely?
I hate to keep coming back to theorizing Glenn Lowry, but
this is Glenn Lowry number one.
But again, the part of it, I think, and I think I had the same thing, is I think both of us didn't like when people told us that we weren't supposed to be thinking something, right? That I think that's a continuity, right? That every time there's an orthodoxy, right, that says you're not supposed to think this, you're not supposed to see this. The thing that's like right in front of your face can't be true, right? So again, when I was in college at GW in 1986 in DC, right? This was like the low point of DC, right? The city I grew up in. I grew up in Prince George's County, Maryland, right? This was when Marion Barry was mayor. This is right back before he had resigned from the crack and all that stuff, right? The city, the rates of murder were out of control. The crack epidemic was out of control, right? All these things, it really felt like the wheels had come off, right? And part of me was just like, we should be able to tell people that the freaking wheels are come off, right? You can't just not say that. And I think one way to think about a continuity between a lot of these Glenn Lowrys is whenever there's and maybe with me too, right? Whenever there's this orthodoxy that tells us we're not supposed to say something, right? Our instinctual reaction is to say it, right? And that isn't the most flattering theory of our own behavior. We could come up with a more flattering ex post theory of our behavior. But I think there's probably something psychologically resonant about that, right? And then we build a lot of stuff on top of that, that thing, right? But underneath it, the really fundamental thing is something pretty bone deep and psychological, right? That sort of has continuity across all the changes that we have over time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense to me. I mean, I might modify it a little bit to say they tell me that I'm not supposed to say it, but they don't give an argument.
Right.
In other words, they make a loyalty claim on me. They say to me, whose side are you on? If you're on our side, you're not supposed to say that. In other words, they don't provide evidence. They don't give logic. They don't say what you're saying is wrong for the following reasons. They say, you're saying this, and do you know who else is going to be made happy by the fact that you're saying this?
Right.
As if my not saying it was somehow going to cause other people to not notice that it's true. I mean, the it that we're talking about here is the black family as a social institution that nurtures the human development of African American people is in deep trouble. The it that we're talking about here is if you want to open up a small business on a certain avenue in certain parts of the city, you need 3-inch thick plexiglass bulletproof barriers to protect you from the thugs that'll come in and steal $100 from your cash register and leave you bleeding to death on the floor. The it that we're talking about is, have you noticed the gap in academic performance between African American youngsters and others? If we don't address it, and I know the government has to be involved in that, and the schools have to be made better, and it may cost money and whatnot, but if we don't address it, we're not going to be fit to assume positions of leadership and importance in the 21st century. That's what we were talking about, to which the arguments would be, don't say that, don't say that. Do you know who else is saying that?
Right. You're
and that made me furious. Pardon?
Right. You're being Ashonda to the neighbors, right? You're an embarrassment to other people.
I'm sorry. Okay. Yeah. Indeed.
Right. But isn't there something similar that happens again in the mid '90s when you're also embedded in a community, right? Of this sort of, AI, neoconservatives, right?
Yeah, this is Glenn Lowry number 2. Just
right. Then there's an orthodoxy, right? This is when, this book comes out, Murray and Herrnstein's book comes out, right? And there's a orthodoxy there too, right? And what is your actual community, right? As much as your academic community, right?
Yes.
And then everybody else, right, is saying, oh, we can't, go out and say that like Murray and Herrnstein's book is a bunch of crap and is bad social science, and D'Souza is just again, we know much more about him now, is just a hustler, right? And not a serious, thinker. We're all supposed to treat these people as if they're serious thinkers, right? And they're not, right?
That's right. So in the 80s, I became a neocon, and somewhere along in the mid-90s, I abandoned that vocation. And the books that you mentioned coming from fellows at the American Enterprise Institute, where I was a senior advisor to the president, a man called Christopher Demuth, the book by Dinesh D'Souza, which I won't say much about, The End of Racism, which I thought was infantile and, mildly racist and offensive, but certainly not constructive. He's making fun of and pointing fingers at black liberals with whom he and I, for that matter, disagreed, but he does so in a way that I thought was not intellectually respectable and was, as I say, mildly offensive. But the more important book, of course, was Charles Murray and Richard Herrnstein's The Bell Curve. And you're quite right to say that people circled wagons in the midst of the firestorm that book created, Intelligence and Class Structure in American Life, a book that argues forcefully for the heritability of intellectual abilities, IQ, being determined genetically, and amongst other things, it's not their main point, observes that there are significant IQ differences between racial groups that might account to some degree for the disparity in social standings of African Americans. But yes, the book came in for fierce criticism, some of it hysterical and ideological, some of it quite well grounded in the sciences, in the neuropsychology and cognitive psychology, and in empirical political science, sociology, and economics. Many, many reviews were written. And when I went to the director of the president of the American Enterprise Institute and said, we need to have a conference, after the conference that introduces Mary's book, which the AEI spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on promoting. And a year later, the reviews are in, and the reviews are very tough, and I think Mary should answer them. There are 300,000 copies of that book sitting on American coffee tables, And it's a kind of totem. It's iconic, and it makes a pretense to a scientific demonstration, and the scientific community is weighing in, and Murray should respond. And Demuth tells me that Murray is tired of the bell curve debate, that he wants to move on. Okay, so I, took exception to that. And my friends at Commentary Magazine, and thank you for allowing me this, Steve. My friend Norman Podhoretz. My friend Neil Kazadoy. These were the publishers and editors at Commentary Magazine who had been glad to take my copy when I was blasting Jesse Jackson or blasting Daniel Patrick Moynihan for being too liberal on social policy issues, or ranting about how the liberal racialist ideology, the civil rights ideology, was off the rails. They were glad to take my copy, refused my proposal for a critical review of Charles Murray's book, and instead gave their magazine over to Murray himself for a 2,500-word piece in which he, quote, answers the critics, close quote, not by addressing any of their scientific criticisms, but instead by saying, oh, political correctness couldn't possibly allow for an academic to like my book. No wonder all the journals are full of critical reviews of my book. That kind of was the last straw for me. And if I just may, you're right. Everybody else had a community outside of this cabal of neoconservative political writers. They were going to Jerusalem, or they were going to Dublin, or they were going somewhere. Okay? And that was all respected. You could be Catholic, like James Q. Wilson. You could be Jewish, like Norman Podhoretz and many, many others. Okay? But you couldn't be black in this company. That is to say, you couldn't have any fealty defined by the fact that you grew up on the south side of Chicago that was worth respecting. In other words, what I learned there, and I'll stop, is that my presence was conditioned on a rejection of my roots. Okay? Other people could have roots, and that could be filtered in and factored into the deliberation. My having roots was a capital offense. It was treason against the group. And that made me come to the understanding that the role that I was playing in the group was not so much an equal contributor to an ongoing and open debate, but rather as a token, a shill, a front, a cover for what it is that they were doing. Okay, thus endeth the soliloquy of Glenn Lowry.
So, I mean, one way to think about this, again, is that you can almost always tell these positions as, I had a belief at one point and then I had another belief, right? But you could equally, again, my positions on these is, it's equally important to say you had an affiliation at each point, right? You were part of a community, right? Now, again, I think it's important to note there that, the thing that caused you to break was when you realized you had a particular kind of subordinate status in the community that was only really revealed when you challenged its totem. Right?
Well said.
And that's the moment when you realize that, you thought you were in equal status with everyone else until you actually challenged their positions, and that's when you realize that you were performing a function for them, right?
Indeed.
And it probably was the case that recognizing that performance of the function was what caused you to sort of have a break in your own identity, right? So one way to think about this is, there's a path dependent quality to identity, right? It gets reinforced not only by prior beliefs, right? We have all these things we said, right? And you don't want to contradict the things you already said, because then people will say, well, if you were wrong then, maybe you're wrong now, right? But the other thing is, right, you have all these communal identities, right? You're on the board of,
yes.
FBI, friends, right? You're friends with Richard John Newhouse, right? You've shared,
yes.
Very important, emotional links to these people. They're not just intellectual, right? These are people who you probably, you told secrets to, right? You shared, very, and so to break from that, right, is as important as the ideas, right? You're actually choosing to alienate yourself from a community that in some sense was definitional of who you were, right? So you would have to figure out who you were
anew.
If you weren't part of that, right?
Indeed.
Who are you then, right? You have to reconstruct identity, right?
No, I think what you're saying is important, and
so
I'm sorry, you're not finished. Go on.
This is where I think that there's a kind of it's useful to model this as a kind of punctuated equilibrium, right? That is, you have something that's anchoring that identity, right? It's both a set of beliefs, it's a reputation, it's affiliations, right? And then something causes it to break, right? And it probably is something, it's probably an endogenous theory of change here, right? It was something that was already always there, right? And something, right, caused you to not pay attention to it, right? Probably the signs that you were in a subordinate status in this community were always there, but you were engaging in some kind of selective perception, right? Just to cause you not to notice until the sign of it was so powerful that it would force you to sort of rethink all of your identity and affiliation, right? Does that make sense?
It does. It does. I want to say a couple of things. And you mentioned Richard John Newhouse, the late Father Richard John Newhouse, who was first a Lutheran pastor and then a Catholic priest when he reverted, I think he would say, to the church, thinking that the Reformation had been over for a few centuries and, there was one church. This was Father Richard John Newhouse, who became an advisor to popes and ran a very important institution in New York City called the Center for Religion and Public Life. And he was a friend of mine, true, in my neoconservative phase. But the thing I want to emphasize is he remained a friend of mine after I changed, because our bond actually wasn't political. Our bond was spiritual. And even when I fell away from a fervency of my own Christian profession, the fact that Richard and I had shared that kind of bond transcended the fact that I was now no longer on the reservation.
Well, he was sort of the confessor to you, right? For you, right?
Oh, he was indeed. And that's one of the stories I'm going to tell in my memoir, and I'm not going to tell it here.
Okay,
but indeed he was. But I want to say another thing, because I have a slightly different model than your punctuated equilibrium, hysteresis, path dependency model, although not unrelated. My model would be Bayesian, but
hysteresis, because I don't think you had a sort of low level equilibrium, right? That would be hysteresis would presume that you were in some low level equilibrium, right? You were there, sluggish. You were whatever the intellectual equivalent of, mass unemployment within, would be. Anyways,
I'm using it as synonymous with path dependency. Okay. But the point I want to make is so. The statistical model of learning, of taking on new information and changing belief, is a person who has some kind of, they call it a likelihood function. They have some kind of theory about the relationship between what they can see and what they don't know. And as new data come in, they update the parameters of their model to make it as optimally calibrated to explaining what they've observed as they can possibly make it. They maximize the likelihood of the thing that they're seeing by adjusting the parameters of their model.
Right. They're smoothly adjusted.
Indeed. Generally, it would be smooth unless the new information were massively disconfirming of whether the prior belief had been. But it's all rational. Okay. On the other hand, if we bring along the kind of human psychology that I know that you want to talk about, we recognize that people adjust their beliefs in part based upon what others to whom they're connected are believing. Okay. And they choose the others to whom they're connected, right? So the dynamic model that I'm envisioning would have two parts to it. One would be the rational Bayesian part. New information comes in and we update accordingly in a maximal likelihood way. But the other would be the endogenous association part, in which if the beliefs are dissonant relative to my community, I can do one of two things: change communities or not modify my beliefs so much as the new information would suggest that I should do. And both of those things presumably go on. People avoid information that's disconfirming to what it is. That's the consensus within their community. But people do also sometimes reach a point where they, as it were, in defense of the integrity of their own intellectual, autonomy, decide that they have to go into the wilderness because they can't live with a group of people who are not willing to accept what the facts compel them to believe on their own account.
So can I just stop on one thing? I mean, one thing to note here, right, and I think it's relevant to the point about Murray and Herrnstein, is all through this, you did actually have multiple identities, right? That is, you've got this identity, right? You're in a university, right? You're still at the Kennedy School, you're at BU, right?
Right.
You're an academic economist and a social scientist, and that's a really profoundly important identity to you, right?
Indeed.
In some sense, that's the thing that distinguishes you from all the other African Americans who are out there talking on the, in public intellectuals. You can say, look, I'm a, first-rate social scientist. I publish, I've always seen you wave the fact you were in the, the Econometric Society, right, as a kind of,
not all of them, but many of them.
You know what I mean, right?
Yeah.
But I think you're saying, so
yeah,
in a way, part of the point, I think one way to model the Murray and Herrnstein thing, right, is that being forced to sort of not just say that the emperor has no clothes was also in a way compromising of that very important identity you had as a social scientist, right? That is, you couldn't just go and say, oh yeah, this is perfectly good work when everybody, in your academic community knows that this is junk social science.
This point is very well taken.
Right. So that, I think, may explain a break is that, if you've got multiple identities, one model of this is those two things are kind of abrading against one another. Right. And that's what that thing did, is it caused a sort of thing where you really had to choose which of those identities to affiliate with it. You couldn't sort of hold hold them together simultaneously anymore. Does that make sense?
Well, I mean, in other words, how am I going to face James Heckman, the Nobel laureate economist at the University of Chicago, who's a good friend of mine, and I would see from time to time at professional meetings and whatnot, and who was all over the extensive quantitative statistical examination of evidence about IQ and heritability and social outcomes. How am I going to face him if I'm a flack? If he looks at me and he sees a flack, I've just lost standing with Jim. Now, when I go to the AEI and I say we need to have a conference, I was hoping they would invite Jim Heckman and other people, and we would let the chips fly where they may. You know what I mean? In other words, I could still be a conservative in Jim Heckman's eyes, but I could not be a slavishly devoted to the AEI party line conservative when the evidence, as far as Jim was concerned, seemed to be pointing in another direction.
Right. So, you got to show your face at the AEA meeting in January every year.
Indeed.
Right. And people can't say, oh, that's Glenn Loury. That's the guy who wasn't saying anything about the fact that, his organization AEI was like putting out all this stuff that everybody knows is junk. And he was just sitting there, twiddling his thumbs.
Yeah, that's the Glenn Loury who used to be a serious economist.
Hey.
No, I wouldn't have want that said about me. No, but that's what would have been said. But anyway,
so, all right. So I think we got through that. So then you've got there's this religious one, right, which I think has there's a different mechanism in that, right? I mean, again,
let me clarify for the audience. We are talking about Glenn Loury changing his mind. The previous discussion was about Glenn Loury going from neoconservative to less neoconservative to maybe I'm going back to being more neoconservative now. And now we're talking about a different thing.
But there was this period in the middle where you were identifying yourself. I've seen this written as
a man of the left,
right?
Yeah, so I was identifying myself as a liberal,
right? And so there was some period, and you can say this, right? That we don't want to jump over that period where I think you seem sort of happy to not to be doing that thing anymore, where you were fighting against other African Americans, right? You've told the story before, right?
Yes.
Where you could, come in and say, hey, I was lost, but now I'm found. And
welcome home, Glenn. I could go and get the warm affection of my brethren at the Afro-American Studies Department at Harvard University in like quarters. Yes.
Yeah, right. You could, right. So
I was trying to become rehabilitated.
That was a thing, though. I mean, I think you were literally, that was a thing you were thinking you were doing, right? You were aware of yourself performing that action, right?
I confess it. True.
Right. So that's, I don't know, in a way that's a less interesting, just identity wise in terms of, building some theory about this, that's a less interesting period, right? But that was pretty comfortable for a while, right? In a way, if you think about the anatomy of racial inequality, that was not, I still think is an amazing book, but it's not the book that was going to piss everybody off in that community.
Correct. No, that's 2002 based on lectures I gave at Harvard in 2000. And indeed, I had been invited by Henry Louis Gates Jr. in 2000 to come and give these prestigious Du Bois lectures at Harvard, which was already a sign of my rehabilitation. Right. I was introduced with praise by the likes of William Julius Wilson and Lawrence Bobo, who are prominent sociologists at Harvard working on race issues. And they praised me to the heavens. And I gave 3 lectures. The room was packed, and I got, great reviews coming out of there. And yes, it felt good to be restored to my brethren for a minute or two. So
I want to go, but before we get to the last Glenn Loury one, do we need a different set of tools to understand the religious change? A
different set of tools than the interaction between revising your beliefs in the face of evidence, and also being made to or encouraged to cling to your beliefs based upon the networks of affiliation
But
that
also,
you're embedded in.
I think there's also this multiple identity thing, which is important in that, right? That about sort of identities abrading against one another, and producing sort of moments of punctuation or something, right? So that, I don't know if any of those help you explain the religious change. Because again, when I knew you, right, when I first started knowing you, right, I felt like you were right in the center of when you had, when you'd become a very seriously evangelical Christian.
I was in effect a deacon in my church. I was
Right.
going to Bible
And
studies
that
at
was,
6 o'clock
and that
in the
was just
morning.
that was a serious. I mean, that was a hardcore, right? I
That's
know.
total commitment. That's getting on your knees and praying. That's worshiping every Sunday with fervor for 3 hours or 4, if that's what it came to.
And so you've told the story again. Some of these, I feel like these are like this whole conversation is notes on previous blogging heads, but.
But you asked whether we need a different theory, and while I don't want to theorize on the fly about something quite so serious, my instinct is to say absolutely yes, we need a different theory. Because I think it's one thing to talk about the social connections. I have a network of affiliates. We are a part of a movement. We have a common set of beliefs. If I lose face with these people, I'm in the wilderness. And it's another thing to talk about the self relationship, which I want to say now in my post-Christian phase, and I could say a great deal more about that, and you're right, I've talked about it before here at Blogging Heads, but just to emphasize the fact that in my now post-Christian phase, I want to say there was a certain amount of self-delusion or suspension of disbelief or a kind of bracketing of the rational function and a surrender to something which certainly had a communal component to it. The church fellowship, fellow believers, they come around you, there's a comfort in that and so forth. But also had something that was entirely sort of self-referential about it. And for me, the key in my theorizing about this matter is my struggle with addiction.
Right. Can I interrupt us on one second?
Of course. Come on. We're having a conversation.
Let me give you a theory that's wrong. But we've been talking about self-command before. Right?
Yes.
And, we're both huge fans of Tom Schelling and the Infinite Contest for Self-Command.
Yes.
Right? And, at a much lower level, right, I quit smoking this year. And so I'm at least a little bit of aware, not anywhere nearly as profound as the addiction that you had, but an addiction, nonetheless. The religion was in some ways, one way to think about it is it was an instrument of self-command, right? That is, we think about the various things we do, right, in order to prevent ourselves from doing things we know are self-destructive, right? And a lot of the tools that Schelling was talking about were sort of very individual. They were intimate, right? They were private.
Yes.
But we also engage in collective things in order to get self-command, right? We embed ourselves in communities that'll keep us from doing the thing we don't want to do, right? And so I think, why did I quit smoking, right? Honestly, if it was just me and I was single, I'd be smoking while we're having this conversation. There's no question about that, right? But, my wife did not want me to smoke, right? And I had kids, right? That played a function. My parents didn't want me to smoke. Everybody wanted me not to smoke, right? I don't think I think mainly the reason I quit is just everybody was tired of me smoking and didn't want me to smoke anymore, right? And I'm, in some sense, the reason I think of it every day, literally every day, I want a cigarette. I wake up in the morning, I'm like, boy, would I love a cigarette now.
Yep.
But I know that if I do that, right, mainly it's not that, I'm going to get sick later on 20 years from now. I don't give any crap about any of that, right? What I know is, right, there's going to be some loss of communal, right? My wife is going to be pissed off at me. My parents are going to be pissed off at me. Maybe my son will see me smoking and then I'm going to have to deal with all that, right? To what degree was the sort of persistence of your religious affiliation in part a fear that, it was that communal identity that was keeping you from going back to your drug addiction, your substance abuse?
Well, I think you explained very well how Alcoholics Anonymous works. That is to say, a group of drunks, people with a substance abuse problem, who create a community and they go to meetings and, sometimes it's every night. And for an hour, in smoke-filled rooms usually, with a lot of caffeine, they sit around and they talk about how they didn't drink today. Or if they did drink and they don't want to drink, they talk about how they drank today.
Right.
Okay. And while it's not punitive, the reactions of others in an AA meeting, in an AA group, usually a drunk, an alcoholic, a drug addict, I was a cocaine addict myself, will have a set of meetings that he or she goes to regularly and a set of people who anticipate them to come to the meetings and look forward to hearing them report on how they're doing and so forth. Not so much that they would judge you negatively for the fact that you drank. They wouldn't. They'd welcome you back. But you know that you, in some sense, endanger the whole community by your drinking. The whole point of us being here together is that we have made a commitment to one another that we don't want to drink. So I'm crediting your idea that social pressure can be an instrument. But I want to deny that that was the primary motivation of my own religiosity. They were not unrelated. They were not unrelated. But where I was going, where I would want to go with this theory, which we're doing on the fly here, I need to think more seriously about this, is with this issue of surrender, of a kind, the problem of self-command, okay? So I have a high-level self who wants not to smoke cigarettes or not to be high on cocaine or not to, pick up prostitutes or whatever the bad habit is that the person is trying of behavior to desist from. I have this high-level self who has some idea about wanting to be a better person. But then I have this craven, fragile, weak, daily self who you say you want a cigarette every day, and every day you have to not smoke. And that guy is in some sense a different person every day than the guy who stands back from the whole thing and says, I'm not going to be a smoker for all these good and sufficient reasons. And how do you control the behavior of that guy? Okay, so one way of doing it is social pressures, as you've been describing. But another way of doing it is like disempowering.
Let me stop you. I mean, so it's not just social pressure, though, right? The other thing that groups do is surveillance, right? Somebody's watching, right? That is,
monitoring,
my wife
incentives associated with, the punishments that might flow from people seeing you depart from your promises.
Right. So more, right, is, I have to give an account, right? Every day, my wife gives me a hug, right? But she's also smelling me, right?
Yep.
So she's not just giving me love. She's also engaging in surveillance, right? That community of people, they're out there watching, right? And you're aware of them watching you, right? That's part of the mechanism by which, we get that higher self to control the lower self, right? Is that we embed ourselves in people who we know are going to watch us, right? To keep us, keep the
duly observed, Steve. But I'm going someplace else. I mean, I note that the social function is more than just people liking you or not. It's also people giving you information, creating incentives, giving this kind of dynamic feedback, watching you, monitoring you, and so on. Okay, so that's a social. But I want to talk about this internal thing that happens with a person, where what do the 12 steps say? I know I hope you've never been in an AA program. I hope you never have to go to one. But the first thing they tell you in there is that, I admitted that I was an alcoholic and that my life had become unmanageable. I made a decision to turn my will over to the care of God as I understand him. And I undertook a program of reconstruction. I surrendered. In other words, I know I can't beat alcohol. If it's just on me, I'll be drinking until the day I die. I gave up my will.
Right.
Okay. This kind of thing, which I say is an act in a way of self-delusion. Can one really give up one's will? Okay. So, but nevertheless, this idea, left to me, I'm a wretch. Left to me, I'm helpless and hopeless and I'm lost. Okay. Thanks be to our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Okay. What Paul says in Romans, somewhere in the Bible, about the good that I do not, that which I would not, nevertheless I do. Okay? What he's saying is, I know the right thing, and yet I also know that left to my own devices, more than once, I'm not going to do the right thing. But by surrendering my will over to the care of my Savior, I become empowered in a transcendent way. Now, I'm not asking you to believe this. In fact, I don't believe it. My post-Christian Glenn Lowry doesn't believe it. But I did believe it at one point in time, and I think believing that thing, quite apart from the social function of being embedded in a community, helped me to not use the substance that I was trying to not use. on a daily basis. It gave me a different angle of vision on myself that allowed me to get past the urge to use. And after enough days went by, when I didn't succumb to that urge, the urge went away.
Right. But when the urge went away, the the functionality of both the belief and the affiliation declined. Is that what happened? Right.
No.
Just go back. Sorry.
Yeah.
So you didn't. I mean, you were saying that when one of the purpose, again, I'm using the word function, and usually in social science, anyone uses the word function, I jump down their throat, but I'll give that up for right now.
Mm-hmm.
That the function is that that set of beliefs, right, reinforced you, gave you a sense of who you wanted to be, right, that helped you on a daily basis resist along with the communal, right. But I guess one question is, one thing that required you to do again was to make that decision to surrender, right? To say, I can't control myself, yes, right? Only through this external power, right? Which is both the divine external power and this communal external power can I control myself, right? But in a way, that's another thing that's like a braiding against other things you believe, right? Which is part of that identity, the same identity, I think, that's, rejecting being told that you have to do things because, you're a neoconservative or you're a progressive later on. There's something unstable about that, that surrender and this other part of your identity, right? This part of your identity that's doesn't like being told what to believe, doesn't like being told you have to believe things for which there's no evidence, right? Do you think that's what's going on there?
Yeah, that is what's going on. I just want to review the bidding a bit. I admitted that I was an alcoholic and that my life had become unmanageable. That's the first step. I came to believe that a power greater than myself could restore me to sanity. That's the second step. I made a decision to turn my life over to the care of God as I understand him. That's the third step. All three of these steps, this is about Alcoholics Anonymous, not about religion, right, are important, right? First of all, it's getting out of denial. It's acknowledging your condition. Secondly, it's coming to believe that a power greater than yourself. And that's where there's a certain amount of self-delusion for a guy like me, who is basically a materialist and a rationalist. Okay.
Right.
And then I made a decision, having come to believe, to turn my life over, okay, which is a part of this thing. Within the AA movement, it doesn't get to be a thick kind of thing, but within a Christian congregation, it becomes very thick and specific. And yes, it did great. I mean, you're writing my memoir for me to a certain degree here. It did great with other dimensions of my identity. As a rationalist, as a guy who got a PhD at MIT, as a mathematician, as a person who believes in evidence, as a guy who reads, Steven Pinker or whomever, right, about the way the world is put together and what the last 400 or 500 years of inquiry about how it functions has taught us. That's our legacy. That's our heritage. I mean, and it's not theistic, actually. I mean, it's not necessarily inconsistent with theism, but it very much is a different register of thought. And yes, and you know the event that, and I've talked about this here, that finally turned me. It was Sherry DuPont's funeral. We both knew this woman. She was a friend of ours at this institute that I ran, and I'm in my church, and she dies tragically at a very early age. And the congregants are celebrating that she's now with Jesus. Right. And all I want to do is go and get Friedrich Nietzsche off the shelf of my library and start reading about these cowardly Christians who won't look down into the abyss of life where there's meaningless suffering, where millions can be shoveled into mass graves, where people die for no good reason, and where rather than confront the kind of stupefying weight of that, people wrap themselves in this warm blanket of credulity about how it's all supposed to work together for good because God is in control. That just drove me over the edge.
Can I say one more thing? I mean, this is really a question. I don't know, but your church was very specifically African American church, right? There was a kind of performance. There was a kind of performance of blackness, right? That's involved in that church, right? That's a choice, right? Of a very, very specifically African American mode of worship. and also a community, right? That church has a very specific role in Boston, right, in the area, and what it means to be African American in Boston, right? So in some sense, right, well, again, this gets to the anchoring thing before the change, right? What's the thing that's causing you not to, recognize the thing you recognize when you have your break, right? Is in some ways recognizing that would also alienate yourself from at least one way that you'd understood to be African American, right? Which is of this very thickly religious, thing that also has lots of, social commitments embedded in it, right? So if you alienate yourself from the religious part, you're also going to have to figure out some other way to be black, right? Does that make sense?
I hadn't thought about that. And it does make sense, at least this issue of alienating myself from blackness, although I wonder if, okay, so my wife and I were members of the church. My wife suffered from breast cancer and she died. She was buried in the church. Wonderful funeral. And I would say for 2 years after her death, which was 4.5 years ago, I went back pretty regularly to Sunday services at the church. And I missed my wife. And the cultural expressions, the music, the preaching, the praying, the communal interactions were very, as you say, black. They were very peculiar to this niche within American society of African-American religiosity. And I found a great deal of comfort there. Perhaps not so much in terms of my racial identity. I mean, I was a guy already in my 60s when this was going on, and I'd like to think a pretty stable concept of my blackness. I didn't necessarily need to be in a black congregation to be reminded of my blackness. But there certainly was a lot of comfort there in terms of enduring the loss of my spouse. But earlier in my life, I think, other perverted conceptions of what I thought to be authentic blackness did have an influence on me. I mean, I would say the alienation, I'm just talking about Glenn Loury now, and thank you for allowing me to do so, that I experienced when I emerged as a world-class theorist of economics. And there were no, or almost no, blacks who were that. And even the blacks who I knew who were PhDs in economics weren't that.
Right.
And the esoteric character, econometric society, mathematical, asymptotic behavior of Markov, all this kind of, stochastic calculus, kind of epsilon delta arguments about continuity, etc., where they were the grist for my intellectual life, but they were very distant from the rhetoric, the discourse, the kind of sense of identity associated with blackness. And I think I tried to treat myself, quote unquote, in my sense of alienation from blackness by reverting to, I'm going to just say, ghetto-style behaviors in terms of seeking excitement on the streets, in terms of going into, late-night soirees, right, and participate, because my background growing up in Chicago had been significantly steeped in that. I hadn't been ruined by it, but I had seen many people ruined by it. I knew the insides and outs of it. I could code switch with the best of them. I knew how to manage in those environments. And I kind of countered the sense of alienation from blackness that was associated with my intellectual development by patting myself on the back that whereas my black peers in the academy wouldn't survive for a minute in a courtyard of a public housing project without getting robbed, I could go in there, turn my hat sideways, and get by.
But isn't a way? I mean, again, I'm sort of interested in the similarity between that and then the switch to this very, very, challenging and demanding form of Black evangelical Christianity, right? That is also something that your colleagues at the Kennedy School couldn't do either.
Point well taken.
Right? I mean, that's
very
also,
well taken.
Right? Something, and again, it probably also is something. I mean, that was around when you were in Chicago too, right? That was something you must have had,
I did.
Relatives, right? I
met my first wife in such a congregation,
right?
When I was 17 years old,
right? So okay, so I want to go to the last one. So the new Glenn Loury, the new Glenn Loury, right? There's some point when I don't know when it happened, right? When clearly you started getting frustrated by the orthodoxy on racial issues, right? We can associate with Black Lives Matter, but I don't know it's just that, right?
It's
But
not just Black Lives Matter, but yeah, you're right.
But there's some point where, again, when you were writing the lectures on mass incarceration, right there, and I think, and you should get credit, right, for the fact that you were out ahead on that, right, before a lot of the debate about the significantly out ahead on that, right? But you were out ahead within something that was was orthodox within that sort of liberal.
Can I just explain quickly, Steve, to the audience? 2007, I'm invited to give these lectures, the Tanner Lectures in Human Values at Stanford. 2007, okay? That's 8 years ago. That's before anybody ever heard of Michelle Alexander. And I give this Jeremiah of attack on the racial suppressive dominating dimensions of mass incarceration as an institution, as a response to disorder in public. That was in 2007. I just want people to know the details. Thanks.
Right. Okay. So you wrote that, right? And that, that argument would be perfectly consistent, or at least you could think of it as perfectly consistent with the tone of a lot of the discourse on racial issues today, right? A lot of more subtlety than in it, but I'm being rough now, right?
Right.
So, at what point did you decide? In a way, I think one model of this is when everybody starts agreeing with you, you start getting itchy, right?
Yeah, I reject that.
Everyone got everyone started agreeing with you too much, and then you were like, no. What explains that, and when does that happen?
Okay, so this is not a stretch. It is a similar process as what has gone on with me in the context of the affirmative action debate, where the old Glenn had been anti-affirmative action, the restored to liberal fraternity Glenn had been pro-affirmative action, and the current Glenn is now doesn't give a damn whether or not Judge Scalia and company decide to interpret the Constitution so that affirmative action is held to be inconsistent with the 14th Amendment. And I don't want to get off into the details of affirmative action, but I'm saying in a way, they're kind of the same process that's going on, which is that whereas on mass incarceration, and I still believe, we created these punitive institutions out of a kind of obsessive politics of retribution and punishment with disregard for the complex historical, economic, and social forces that produced the phenomenon we're talking about, which is crime.
Right.
Okay. Antisocial behavior, which needs to be dealt with. There's no question that it needs to be managed. We need police to protect us. We need prisons to punish people. We need to create incentives. We need to stand for victims. We need to affirm order, things like this. On the other hand, we create these massive institutions, 2.25 million people, et cetera, I won't go into details, and we don't even have any reflexive, self-critical dimension to it. We walk into a blind alley and we don't turn around. I mean, we just keep going down the same road. And surely part of the reason for that is we have contempt for the humanity of the people who are suffering the most under this, who are black and brown and poor people by and large, and that needs to be denounced. On the other hand,
you might call that malign neglect.
Indeed, you might call it, and Michael Tonry does call it malign neglect. Indeed, you could call it malign neglect. On the other hand, if you live in a community in which people are carrying guns, in which gangs are settling scores, in which people are robbing stores, in which drug dealing is going on constantly on the streets, in which children are being recruited into ways of life that are destructive and so forth and so on, you desperately need order. You want there to be a response to that somehow. So there's a balance here. There's a question of the weighting of equities. There's a question of prudence, okay? And it's the ignoring of the other side of the balance that is characteristic of the contemporary anti-incarceration and anti-police discourse against which I'm reacting. I don't regard myself as having abandoned the position that I had in 2007 because too many people are agreeing with me. It's that the people who are agreeing with me are not subtle in the way that they're thinking about the problem, and are not aware of the fact that there is, you know, there are alternative important considerations that need to be weighed in the balance. So Black Lives Matter wants to talk about what police do to black people, but they don't want to talk about what's happening to black people at the hands of people who are not police. Right. The police are implicated in what's happening to black people at the hands of people who are not police. If murder goes down because of forceful policing, the main beneficiaries of that are blacks. These are trade-offs. These are not, as it were, black and white issues. They're not issues well suited to megaphones. There are subtle issues. And so that's likewise with affirmative action. I want to say, yes, come on. We don't have to be absolutely colorblind when we're selecting people for these colleges. We're not absolutely blind to other stuff. Why wouldn't we use our discretion to try to promote a reasonable social goal like integrating elite institutions racially given our history? Of course we would. On the other hand, large disparities in the academic performance of people who are being admitted to elite venues by race creates problems. Do we want to lock ourselves into a pattern in practice of how we populate these elite venues in which the presence of African Americans is largely rationalized by their racial identity, not by their capacity to command the intellectual materials that are ongoing? I'm not saying blacks at elite colleges are stupid. Please, I know you understand, but I don't want anybody hearing this to misunderstand. I'm saying the SAT test score gap and the differences in the advanced placement courses and the performances are real things, and we need to address the real disparities as well as to count the heads of whom we're admitting to these institutions.
Let me make a point just on those two issues, right?
Yeah.
So, and I think this gets us to a last point we should.
Yeah, we're at 1 hour. We can have another conversation because we didn't talk about your stuff at all.
Please, I think I can tie this up with a bow here in a second, right?
You do it.
Which is, on the affirmative action point, and this is something I've thought a lot about recently, is this issue of accepting people through affirmative action who then don't end up graduating with a major they intended to come in with.
Okay.
Right? That is, in some ways, a lot of these, and this is, I think, true on the criminal justice side too, right? Which is some of these choices just don't make any sense as choices, right? That is, with affirmative action, the real thing we want to do is we want to graduate more African Americans in challenging majors that lead to significant professional accomplishment, right?
Yes.
And that's the ultimate thing, right? And so a lot of these are really questions of degree, right? It's not whether you're in favor of affirmative action or not, right? Affirmative action is a thing for which we can, is a continuous rather than a binary variable,
right?
But it's really hard to have a debate about how much, right? That's the real and the reason is, right, that these are, again, totems of identity, right? Whether you're in favor or against affirmative action, right? And saying, well, actually, it's really not an issue of either or, it's an issue of how much, right? Is denying that thing that everybody else is using as a totem of identity, right? The same thing with the criminal justice, right? The real point is, right, that it's hard for police to effectively police communities in which they have hostile relations with the community, right?
Yes.
If the community thinks that the police are an occupying army, they're not going to share intelligence. They're not going to, they're going to stop snitching, right? They're going to do all that kind of stuff, right? And equally, right, that it's, African Americans need policing, right? They're the ones who, this is a critical social service, right?
Correct.
Just as much as any other social service that's done, right? And they need it, right? So these are, in a way, are false choices, right? But they're false choices that are in part pressed upon us by the fact that our positions on all these are not just things we're taking in order to solve a problem, right? They're positions that are things that are badges of affiliation, right? And it's that badge of affiliation that makes it hard to have the debate in the middle, right? And I think it's especially the case, and just go to Black Lives Matter, right? The social movement form of activity is very hard to square with anything in the middle, right? That's the nature of social movement activity, is it's intensely emotionally charged. It's easier to sustain that when you have a clear thing you're against, right? Almost no social movements really, they're against something. They're against segregation, right? We don't have to tell you everything, all the details of what we're going to do after, right? We're against the Vietnam War. We're against patriarchy, right? All social movements are really fundamentally negative in that sense, right? But in that negativity, it's really hard to tell you, right, or to build up some theory about what is it you're going to do after you get rid of the thing you're against, right? And I think, when I think about the issue about mass incarceration, and this is sort of in the conclusion of the book that's coming out this spring, right? One of the things we argue is if you really want to push incarceration levels way down, right? You're going to have much more effective policing, right? That actually reduces offending, right? And you're going to have a much more intensive form of social control outside of prisons, right? You're going to have a really serious parole and probation system that's going to be doing lots of social control, right? Now that's not, that's a middle position. It's messy, right? And it doesn't tell anybody what side I'm on, right? And so I think one of the questions, the serious, questions is it possible to have a public discourse, right, in which all these positions are badges of affiliation, right, that also can lead us to any kind of actual problem solving on the degree or form of affirmative action, or how we're actually going to, reorganize police forces so that they can actually more effectively police urban neighborhoods, right? Or we can make the balance between, how much we're incarcerating and how much we're using what Mark Kleiman calls the outpatient prison, right? All those are things in the middle, right? And, all the real answers to these problems are in the middle. But increasingly part of the problem of political polarization, right, is there's no space there anymore, right, for that discourse on marginal changes in incrementalism and trade-offs and everything, right? And I think that's a serious problem, maybe insoluble problem, right? And I think the real thing, I guess the last point is on criminal justice. The main thing I think that's allowed us to make progress on a lot of these criminal justice issues, and I think it's important for people to recognize how much progress has been made over the last 8 or 9 years, right? Way underneath the surface, right? Lots of these red states are stepping on the hose of incarceration. Georgia, Texas, Mississippi, right?
Yeah.
The main reason they're doing that is, for the most part, people weren't paying attention, right? If you look at the public opinion polls on most important issue, right? When I was in college, going back to the beginning, 86, 87, right? Crime was like number one, number two, right? Now it's literally, at least until recently, was too low to measure, right? Nobody paid attention to it. It was a case of issue death, right? And it was that lack of paying attention that made crime and these issues no longer such a totem of identity, right?
Well, of course,
it allowed people to engage in problem solving. And my last point, my last worry about, and this has been persisting, my worry about Black Lives Matter is by actually making it a much more public issue, right? It returns the issue back to the status of a totem of affiliation.
Okay, you said a lot of things, and I think it was well said. I won't, that's fine. I appreciate that. I was just going to observe that one reason that crime is down as an issue is that crime rates are down as a social phenomenon. I was also going to observe that one thing that makes making the trade-offs in the middle difficult is that in this world of affiliation that you have described well, attention to the facts takes back seat to affirming the party line. You can't do affirmative action in a calibrated way without actually attending to the facts. For example, you'd have to take seriously the differences in the test scores of the kids that you're admitting and decide that a 100-point difference is one thing and a 300-point difference is another, and you're going to, draw the margin somewhere in between, and you'd have to actually look at that and take that seriously. Likewise, you'd have to take seriously the fact that the consequence of a certain kind of proactive policing has reduced the amount of guns on the street or the frequency of homicide by a particular amount, and the people who mostly benefit from that live in the communities of color. You'd have to actually take that seriously, and that's a hard thing for people to do. But Steve, I think we
an hour.
Hmm?
Yeah, we hit the holy sort of hour level, after which Robert Wright sends us a nasty email, right?
Something like that, or people just switch to something else to occupy their time. Thanks very much for coming on the Glenn Show, Steve. Wonderful conversation.
Always a pleasure, Glenn.